Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're looking at Let God Be God Again. This article by Teacher Zhu came out just a few days ago on January 23rd, 2025. And it really grabbed my attention, particularly, with Trump back in the White House. It just got me thinking about these slogans we hear so much, about making America great again. But what does that actually mean? Is it really something we can just achieve through political rhetoric?
Yeah, it's interesting how Teacher Zhu connects all of this to the current political landscape. They start by talking about how America's feeling the sort of fading sense of exceptionalism, like that glory it was known for seems to be slipping away. And there's this sense of decline, this worry about the future. And that's exactly what makes these slogans so appealing, like make America great again. It taps into this nostalgia for supposedly better past.
Okay, so that sets the scene for us. But Teacher Zhu argues that it's not enough to just want to be great, right? You need something more substantial to actually build on, a deeper understanding of human nature. Otherwise, these slogans are just empty promises.
Exactly. They're just empty promises. And Teacher Zhu even argues that those empty promises can actually be dangerous because they make people naive, easily swayed by these powerful figures without actually stopping to think critically about the implications. It's like building a house on sand. It's just not going to stand up to the storms.
So what does Teacher Zhu propose as a more solid foundation for this American greatness then?
Well, they point to the nation's founding principles, things like freedom, equality, human rights, divine authority, moral accountability. But here's the really interesting part. The idea that Teacher Zhu says ties all of these principles together is the fear of God.
Now, I know that phrase might raise some eyebrows for people, especially in our modern diverse society. So what do you think Teacher Zhu means by that? Are we talking about a theocracy, like going back to strict religious laws?
Not necessarily. I think it's more about recognizing a higher moral authority, like a set of values that transcends individual interests, you see. Teacher Zhu argues that for much of the past century, America thrived because its people had this shared reverence for something bigger than themselves. It wasn't about imposing a specific religion, but rather this shared belief that shapes their actions and decisions.
Okay, I can see how that could be a powerful unifying force. But isn't it a bit simplistic to say that this fear of God was the sole reason for America's success? What about all the other factors, right? Like economic policies, social movements, technological advancements?
You're absolutely right. It wasn't the only factor. But what Teacher Zhu is suggesting is that this shared sense of higher purpose, this accountability to something beyond human power structures, played a very significant role. And they warn that as that fear of God fades, so too does America's moral compass. And that makes it vulnerable to the very things it was built to protect against.
That's an interesting perspective. So if this fear of God was so crucial, then why does Teacher Zhu seem so concerned about this growing influence of wealthy entrepreneurs in politics? Figures like Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos, they wield so much power and wealth, and we often see them stepping into these political arenas. How does that fit into this whole let God be God again philosophy?
Yeah, that's where things get even more nuanced. Because Teacher Zhu acknowledges the contributions of these individuals, but they also caution against putting too much faith in them as leaders. They argue that relying on these figures to lead us towards greatness might be, well, a bit naive.
And why is that?
Well, because, as Teacher Zhu points out, human nature doesn't always push us towards selfless sacrifices. We tend to look out for ourselves first. And even the most well-intentioned individuals can be swayed by power and wealth. It's not that these entrepreneurs are inherently bad, but placing blind faith in them, believing that they'll always prioritize the common good over their own interests, well, that could be a recipe for disaster. It's really important to remember that power, even when it's wielded with good intentions, needs to be checked and needs to be balanced.
Okay, that makes sense. So if not these super rich entrepreneurs, then who? What does Teacher Zhu propose as a better model for leadership?
Well, they offer this really compelling example from American history, George Washington's resignation as commander-in-chief. They even mention that famous painting in the Capitol Rotunda that depicts this event.
Right, the one where he's handing over his sword, essentially relinquishing power. Why is that so significant to Teacher Zhu?
Well, the article highlights Washington's resignation as this act of profound humility. It was a way of demonstrating that true authority doesn't rest with any one person, but rather with a higher power. And in this case, that higher power, as Teacher Zhu sees it, is God. By willingly stepping down, Washington solidified this principle of checks and balances, showing that even the most powerful individuals are accountable to something greater than themselves.
So it's not just about having faith or believing in God, but also embodying those principles of humility and accountability in the way we lead and the way we govern. That's a pretty powerful statement.
It is, and it gets to the heart of what Teacher Zhu means by let God be God again. They're calling for this fundamental shift in perspective, this recognition that true greatness doesn't come from amassing power or wealth, but rather from aligning ourselves with a higher purpose, recognizing our own limitations, and ultimately serving something greater than ourselves.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. And I'm already seeing how this article connects to so many current events and debates. But before we get too far ahead, let's just pause here and consider what we've learned so far. We've talked about the allure of these slogans like "Make America Great Again," the need for a deeper foundation than just political rhetoric, this idea of fear of God as a unifying force, and the potential dangers of placing too much faith in these wealthy entrepreneurs.
Yeah, and in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore Teacher Zhu's warnings about what could happen if America strays too far from its founding principles. We'll delve into their proposed solutions and really grapple with this question of whether a nation can truly thrive without this kind of spiritual core.
So we're back, and as we go deeper into this whole "let God be God again" idea, I'm struck by how Teacher Zhu doesn't just, paint this rosy picture. There's this real sense of warning in the article, this concern about what could happen if America loses sight of those founding principles we talked about.
Right, like they make a pretty compelling case that if we start prioritizing power over principle, if we abandon those core values of freedom and equality, well, we risk really undermining the very foundations of American society.
So what do they see as the potential consequences of that? I mean, it sounds kind of dire, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that urgency is intentional. Teacher Zhu argues that things like consolidating power through division, or turning away from those core values, that could lead to a loss of the very freedoms that define America. They suggest that if we become too complacent, too self-indulgent, too focused on individual gain over the common good, well, we risk losing those things that we often just take for granted.
And they tie this potential decline directly to a loss of God's blessing. Right? It's like they're saying that without that spiritual grounding, without that sense of accountability to something higher than ourselves, true greatness just isn't attainable.
That's a really crucial point. And it raises an important question for all of us. Can a nation truly thrive? Can it achieve lasting greatness without this shared sense of something bigger than itself? Teacher Zhu seems to believe that it can't.
So it's not just about being religious or adhering to a specific doctrine, but about recognizing that there's this higher moral authority at play.
Exactly. And that's where this whole let God be God again idea comes in. It's not about imposing a particular religion on anyone, but rather recognizing that ultimate authority rests with something beyond human power structures. It's about aligning ourselves with a higher purpose. And for Teacher Zhu, that purpose is rooted in this idea of God.
Okay, I can see how that concept could be powerful, but it also seems incredibly complex. I mean, America is such a diverse nation with this wide range of beliefs, even those who don't believe in God at all. So how do we reconcile this idea of let God be God again with that reality?
It's a valid question, and, Teacher Zhu doesn't offer a simple answer. They acknowledge that there will always be different viewpoints, different beliefs, even a lack of belief altogether. But the key, they argue, is finding a way to coexist, to engage in respectful dialogue, even when we fundamentally disagree.
So it's not about imposing one belief system on everyone, but about finding common ground based on those shared values we talked about, like humility, accountability, service to something greater than ourselves, even if we arrive at those values from different perspectives.
Precisely, it's about recognizing that we might share a common moral compass, even if the specific directions it points us in vary. And that's where things get really interesting, because it requires this willingness to listen, to try to understand where others are coming from, and to find those points of connection, even amidst our differences.
I think that's a really important point, especially, in our current climate where there's so much division and polarization. But it also seems like a huge challenge, doesn't it? I mean, how do we even begin to have those conversations to bridge those divides when there's so much distrust and animosity?
It's definitely not easy, and Teacher Zhu acknowledges that. But they argue that it's essential if we want to create a society that reflects those higher principles, a society that can truly thrive and achieve lasting greatness. They suggest that those conversations, those attempts to understand one another, even when it's difficult, are the very foundation of a healthy and vibrant democracy.
Wow, that's powerful.
Okay.
So as we wrap up this segment, we've explored Teacher Zhu's warnings about what could happen if America loses sight of its founding principles. Their emphasis on recognizing this higher moral authority and the importance of finding common ground, even amidst this diversity of belief.
Right, and in the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve into some of the nuances of Teacher Zhu's argument, explore what a future where God is God again might actually look like, and consider what this all means for you, for each and every one of us as individuals navigating this complex world.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive into let God be God again, I keep coming back to this question, what does a future where God is God again actually look like? Teacher Zhu paints this kind of big picture, but how does that translate to our everyday lives?
Well, I think that's where Teacher Zhu intentionally leaves things open to interpretation. They allow each of us to kind of wrestle with what it means for our own lives, our own communities. They don't offer a rigid roadmap, but they highlight these certain principles like humility, accountability, and recognizing a higher authority than just human power.
Right, but America is so diverse. How do you reconcile this idea of let God be God again with the reality of all these different faiths? Even people who don't believe in God at all. It can't be about imposing one belief system on everybody.
No, absolutely not. And Teacher Zhu acknowledges that. They're very clear that it's not about dictating religious dogma, but rather about rediscovering those core values that were present at America's founding. Values that they believe were rooted in a shared sense of the divine, even if that took different forms for different people.
So it's about finding common ground, even if we come to it from different starting points. But how do we even begin to do that when there's so much division and polarization?
It's a huge challenge, no doubt about it, but Teacher Zhu suggests that the answer lies in engaging in respectful dialogue, even when it's difficult. It's about listening to understand rather than listening to respond. Seeking that common ground and recognizing that we might share a moral compass, even if the specific directions it points us in vary.
Okay, so let's say we can do that. What might a society that embraces this let God be God again philosophy actually look like in practice?
Well, Teacher Zhu gives us some clues. They talk about leaders serving with humility, checks and balances on power, and really prioritizing the needs of the people over personal gain.
So it's not just about saying God is in charge, but actually demonstrating those qualities in our actions, in the way we govern and how we treat each other.
Exactly. It's about aligning our actions with those higher principles. And I think that's a message that can resonate even with those who might not consider themselves particularly religious.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think Teacher Zhu is issuing a challenge here. It's an invitation to examine our own values and beliefs and consider how we can each contribute to a society that reflects those principles of humility, accountability, and recognizing a power greater than ourselves.
I think that's something for all of us to really ponder. How can we as individuals embody those principles in our daily lives? How can we contribute to creating a world where, as Teacher Zhu puts it, we truly let God be God again? It's a big question and one that doesn't have any easy answers.
Yeah, but it's a question worth asking. And I think that journey of trying to answer it is where the real growth lies.
Well, that's a wrap on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has given you some food for thought, and we'd love to hear your own reflections. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.